Hi everyone, my name's Jordan and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do the get to know the fantasy reader tag. I wasn't tagged in this, I just think it looks cool, so I decided to do it. This tag is kind of like talking about your personal history with the fantasy genre, as well as some of your favorite fantasy things that exist in the fantasy book world. I'm excited to do this one. Fantasy is the main genre I read. I read some other genres, but fantasy is definitely the one I gravitate towards the most. And so yeah, I'm excited to get into it. The first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? This is basically asking, what is the first fantasy books you read? I've talked about this in a few other videos, but I honestly don't totally remember. I remember I liked Magic Tree House, I liked Animorphs, I liked Harry Potter. So basically I just really enjoyed the standard children's fantasy books. I didn't at the time know that it was like fantasy, I just thought they were cool books. I didn't really even know I was a legit fantasy reader until probably like, I don't know, high school, college. Like I read a lot of fantasy, but I never really realized that that was like my genre of choice. I always just kind of like picked up books that looked interesting, regardless of the genre. And when I kind of got more into reading intentionally, I guess, I realized that fantasy was the genre I was drawn to, and I started almost exclusively reading fantasy for a while. As a child and as an early teen, I didn't even consider myself a fantasy reader, which I very much was. Like I loved the Aragon books, I loved Harry Potter, I loved basically all of the standard children's fantasy books. And I've talked about how much I love dragons. I read any book I could get my hands on with dragons as a kid, which I'll link a video above I did that is just all books with dragons. I've always been a super fantasy nerd, I just didn't put that, like I didn't classify myself as a fantasy reader until I was much older. The next question is, if you could be a hero in a story, who would be the author and what trope would you insist on? This one I thought about for a bit because I started thinking about all of my favorite authors, but all of my favorite authors have like pretty tragic character arcs with some of their characters, and like the worlds are all full of strife and conflict, obviously, because that's what makes a story. And I was like, man, I don't want to live in any of those worlds. So then I remembered Legends and Lattes. So I would definitely want Travis Baldree to write my story. And the trope I would insist on is found family, like is seen in Legends and Lattes, because I love a found family. I love getting a group of people together that just becomes who you rely on, becomes your family. And Travis Baldree's world is like, I mean, it says high fantasy, low stakes. That's what I want. I want a high fantasy world where I don't have to go to war and like fight bad guys and like worry about my livelihood every single day. Like, that's what I want. So Travis Baldree for sure. The next question is, what is a fantasy book you've read this year that you want more people to read? I have two for this one. First up, I have Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This one just came out in like February or March, I think. And I got an arc for it and loved it. I was honestly so surprised. I didn't think I would like it that much. I didn't really know what it was about. I just assumed from the cover I wouldn't, which is why we don't judge books by their covers, even though we all do. But I really enjoyed this book. It is about this magical world, and there's this man who is a justice, and him and his two companions travel around this empire, country, whatever, and deal out justice everywhere they go. So like they'll go to a town and the town will give them their grievances and they will mete out justice. The story starts with this man and his two companions going to this town where there's kind of been some sort of like uprising. There's like a religious faction that is trying to fight back, and the justice decides we have to finish what we're here to do and then we can figure out what's going on. But there are multiple warnings from beginning to end of the book that there is a lot going on in like the center of this empire and they're kind of on the outskirts. But the justice keeps saying like, no, we need to finish what we're doing here. So there's kind of like almost like a murder mystery going on of like trying to find these missing people in this small town, but you're also wondering the whole time what's going on in the bigger picture. So the setup for the second book was really great, and I just thought that the story was so fun, and I don't see a lot of people talking about it. I know that Library of a Viking has talked about it, but I really don't see many other people talking about it. So I definitely recommend that you go check out this book. It is very, very good. The second book I want more people to be reading is actually a series that I am partway through, and that is Legends of the First Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. This series is like a super duper prequel to the Rhyrja Chronicles and the Rhyrja Revelations. And I see a lot of people talking about those series, but I don't really see anyone talking about this prequel. I have not read those other two series. I think most people read it in a different order than I am, but for whatever reason, I decided to do it chronologically, so here we are. This series is set I think it's 10,000 years before the other two series. And I'm 4 books in out of the 6 total books, and I am loving it. It is so good. Michael Sullivan's characters are so lovable. You just are rooting for them the whole time. It's very classical fantasy story. A lot of what is so interesting is the characters have to make a lot of tough decisions. They have to make a lot of decisions that are for the greater good as opposed to for their own personal good. And it's just very heartbreaking to read, but it's so masterfully done. This series is so good. And I really hope that a lot of people that read the Rhyrja Chronicles take the time to read this series because they are magnificent. I highly recommend that you read this series, especially if you've read other Michael J. Sullivan works and liked them. Definitely read this series. It is so good. The next question is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre and what's one you haven't read much from? This one, I was literally looking up lists of fantasy subgenres because I don't think there are a lot of fantasy subgenres that I haven't read from, but there are definitely some that I don't like as much, so I kind of twisted it to be that. But the fantasy subgenre I like the most is almost like a cheat, but I love high fantasy. I love a completely different world. I don't want it set in Earth. I don't want it in the United States. I want a totally different world, and I want mythical creatures. I want everything that comes with a high fantasy book. I love, love, love high fantasy. And the genre I don't like as much, which you can probably guess, is urban fantasy. I don't really there's definitely some exceptions. There are some books I've found that I do like the more urban fantasy setting, but a story that's set in New York City with magic is just not as much for me. Magical realism, not as much for me. I definitely prefer a fully immersed fantasy world like that. I don't want to feel any relation to real life. I want it to be as out there as possible. So definitely high fantasy is my preferred subgenre of fantasy. The next question is, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? This one was tough because I'm normally not an auto-buy kind of person. I am one of the few people I feel in the book community that does have a lot of self-control in what books I buy. So there are definitely a few authors though. I've made a list, but for the most part, if it's part of a series that I've started and loved, I will automatically buy it as soon as the next one is announced. But if it's a new series and I'm unsure if I'll like it, then I will wait and read the first one from the library or something and then buy them. But there are some exceptions to that. Brandon Sanderson, I'll pretty much buy anything that he puts out, especially if it's Cosmere related. Evan Winter, I've only read, I think he only has 2 books out, and that's Rage of Dragons and Fires of Vengeance, both part of the Burning series. So I will obviously buy whatever books come out in that series, and if he wants to write a different series, I will buy it. I loved those books. Next up is Leigh Bardugo. A lot of her Grishaverse books have kind of been not as good. I feel this new duology that was out was not as good. But I just love that world so much. I'll buy anything she puts out because that's just who I am. But also, she did Ninth House, love Ninth House, already pre-ordered the second one. So Leigh Bardugo is definitely up there as an auto-buy author. And then last but not least, an author I talk about constantly, and that's Rosaria Munda, who wrote Fireborn and Flamefall, and Fury Song is coming out later this year. So anything she puts out, I will buy. If it's not in this series, I'll still buy it because those books are masterful. And then one I didn't write down that I just thought of, Tamsin Muir. She could write literally anything and I'll buy it. I've already pre-ordered None of the Ninth. Once she's done with the Locked Tomb series, I will buy anything else she writes, anything. She could write anything and I will buy it because she's perfection. Next question is, how do you typically find fantasy recs? I'm sure this is pretty similar to anyone watching this video, and it's BookTube. All of my favorite booktubers that I follow, I will just watch their videos, especially people that I know I have similar reading taste to, because not all the booktubers I have similar reading taste to, I just like their personalities. But there's a few booktubers who we like the exact same books, and basically if they read a book and say it's good, I've added it to my TBR because I will probably also like it. So definitely BookTube, but also like I'll like talk to friends too, like, but most of my book friends are booktubers, so I guess it's kind of one and the same. So really it's BookTube. The next question is, what is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? I won't go too far into this one because it is books I talk about all the time, and if you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me talk about them. Fury Song by Rosario Munda, the third book in the Fireborn series. Nona the Ninth, the third book in the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir, the first one being Gideon the Ninth. And then The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake, which is the second book in the Atlas series, the first one being the Atlas Six. Those are definitely my top three excited for books. Some honorable mentions, I'm excited for Fairy Tale by Stephen King. I'm excited for The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. Yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. So those are some honorable mentions. There's just so many good books coming out this year that I'm very excited for. Next question is, what is one misconception about fantasy you'd like to lay to rest? I think for this one, it's probably similar to like what most fantasy readers say. And I just wish people would not think that fantasy is lesser, like that it's not literature, that it's not worth reading, like you're not... there's just this conception. There's somebody I work with that like told me they told their daughter at a bookstore like, oh, I don't want you to read fantasy, like pick something better. And it's like, what are you talking, like, have you even read fantasy? Because fantasy is so much more than just like the misconceptions of like, oh, there's dragons and elves and blah, blah, blah. Like, yes, there's that, but like, it still teaches you very important lessons, and like, it still deals with very deep, dark, like challenging motifs and themes and things that make you think. Like, it's still just as impactful. And I just never understood people like shitting on other genres that they don't like. Like, I personally don't really like any realism books, like any like contemporary realism, like not my thing. I don't like it. But like, I'm not gonna tell somebody else like, oh, that's a bad book, like why would you read that? It's not worth your time. Like, just because I personally don't like the genre, I'm not gonna tell people that they shouldn't read it and that it's bad. Like, I'm not making myself dumber by reading fantasy. It gets me angry because like so many people just assume that you're a nerd that like reads just like nothing of importance. I don't know. I am a nerd, and I do read some books that are nothing of importance, but like I also read a lot of books that like have really hard-hitting themes that are still have elves and dragons and stuff. Like, I don't know. Like, what does the genre have to do with how good of a literature it is? I don't know. The next question is, if someone you know that doesn't read a lot of fantasy asks for recommendations, what are the first 3 books that come to your mind that you would recommend? This one, I have a video that I'll link above that is like fantasy for beginners. So there's a lot in there, but 3 that I thought of kind of just like looking at my bookshelf. Jade City by Fonda Lee. They are definitely bigger books, and it's a 3-book series. So it's kind of an undertaking, but I think that it's kind of got this like, while it's set in like a not real country, it's still definitely got more of an urban fantasy vibe. So I think it makes it a little easier to like jump into fantasy with that book. And also it's got other like tropes and themes that are very not fantasy. So if it's a good like kind of segue, I think. And then I have Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is another series, and it is an unfinished series, so maybe not the best recommendation. But to me, the fantasy in it, especially in the first book, is a lot more understated. There's not a whole lot of magic. It's more like a heist novel in a fantasy world that's kind of set like, it's kind of inspired by Venice. And then the second book, we get a little bit more fantasy involved, and it's more like a pirate book, like it's all ship-based. So like each book has kind of like a different genre, almost like a different subgenre, a different setting. but they are fantasy. It's just like the fantasy is lesser. So if you are new to fantasy, it's kind of a good introduction because you don't have to learn a really complex magic system. You don't have to learn like a whole new world. It is a whole new world, but it's like not hard to digest. So I think that this is a good introduction. And then I also put Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is a very urban fantasy. It's set at Yale University, and it's based off of some secret societies at Yale that do like dark magic. So this one's pretty easy to digest because it's a relatable setting. It's a real place. It's set in the real world. So it's a little easier to kind of wrap your head around everything. There's not the whole new world. There's not a huge magic system. It's more like occult magic almost. So definitely think those 3 books are pretty good introductions into fantasy. I sometimes see people only recommending standalones, and I get that because like you want to see if you like fantasy, so you read like one book to see. I just find most of my favorites are series. So, and the last question is, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you want to shout out? There's a lot. I've made some new booktube friends recently. RJ Reads, The Rekindled Reader, Read by Kyle, Wicked Good Books, Tall Guy Reads. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of new booktube creators that I have been following that read a lot of fantasy, and I am loving their content, so definitely check all of them out. They're all great. I'll link all their channels down below, and I guess I will go ahead and tag all of those people in this video if you haven't done it already. I have no idea. Again, no one tagged me in this. I've just seen other people do the video and wanted to do it. That is all the questions. I hope you guys liked this video. If you're liking my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know down below some of your favorite fantasy books of the year. Shout out some of your favorite fantasy reading content creators, all of that. If you want to do this tag, just go ahead and do it. If you really like my content, please hit the notification bell to be notified every time I post new content. Thank you guys for watching. Of course, your support means the world to me, and as always, until next time.